Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to the first Tag Tuesday during this wonderful month of Jane Austen July. Quite a while ago, maybe last October, I saw a lovely tag on the channel Coiny Reads, where Charlotte asks us to consider if we might be accomplished women by the standards of Georgian society. She begins by sharing with us part of what is required to be a lady, according to this quote from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Quote, "A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, all of the modern languages, to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved." After seeing Charlotte's video, I immediately put the tag in my folder to answer during Jane Austen July. Brian, of Bookish, was kind enough to tag me months ago, and I hope he hasn't been holding his breath all this time, thinking I might be enough of a lady to actually do the tag in a timely fashion. Alas, but here it is finally. Prompt number 1 is music. Name a favorite literary musician. Before I answer, let me give you a bit of context. I grew up in a family of musicians. Both my father and brother, and now my son, have the amazing ability to pick up almost any instrument and seem to almost instinctively know how to play it well. My father had an amazing ear, too, and was able to hear something once or twice and then play it. Not just the tune, but harmony, etc. My brother and my son are the same way. All are, or were, very interested in folk music of a variety of different places and communities. All three are also knowledgeable about canonical Western classical music, and my son Abe is quite a proficient classical violinist. I grew up without all of those talents, but I did know how to practice, so I learned, beginning at a very young age, to play the piano. In fact, I learned to read music before I learned to read words, and I read words at a fairly tender age. I continued to play fairly seriously throughout college. In very early graduate school, I had surgery for a non-cancerous brain tumor, and that surgery, combined with the tumor itself, meant I lost hearing in one ear, as well as dexterity in my hands. My hands came back, although it took some work over the course of a year, but music has never had the same kind of depth for me as it used to have. I still absolutely love watching my son and brother and various friends play music, but it really isn't a passion for me because of the music itself. All of this is to say that it almost seems appropriate that my favorite literary musician is one whose music is completely silent. I adore Septimus Harding in Anthony Trollope's The Warden. Whenever he needs to entertain himself or comfort himself, he reaches for his air cello, moving his air bow as he imagines playing his favorite pieces. The second prompt is singing, and thank goodness that Charlotte asks us to give a poetry recommendation rather than asking us to raise our voices in song. I've been thrilled lately to see various booktubers responding to Lucas's recent challenge over on his channel Bits of Lit to read and discuss poetry. Steve Donahue has made it into a weekly event, Poetry Thursday. Although I have only made a couple of videos so far and have made them a bit more sporadically, I'm definitely hoping to continue, perhaps one every 2 or 3 weeks. What I'm thinking about today is a very long poem that I've only dipped into so far, but might be putting on my list for Victober, Elizabeth Barrett Browning's novel in verse called Aurora Leigh. Right now, I'm preparing a review of the forthcoming Two-Way Mirror, a biography of Elizabeth Barrett Browning written by Fiona Sampson. The biographer presents this fascinating discussion about how Aurora Leigh is a story of the creation of a female author. The sections I've read are not exactly traditional lyric poetry in the emotionally resonant way, but I suspect it would really interest any feminist readers, as long as you go in with just a bit of context about what it meant to be a woman writer in the first half of the 19th century. Again, I suspect you'll be hearing more from me later in the year, about both Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Aurora Leigh. The next prompt is drawing. Show a book with a beautiful cover. I am totally enamored with the relatively newly illustrated version of Gertrude Stein's The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. The cover picture and the additional artwork in the book are by Maura Kalman. I may have said this before, but I love the art of Matisse, and there are times when the illustrations inside this book remind me of some of his paintings. The fourth prompt is dancing. Name a book with a lively plot. I suspect I may be the only person who chooses this author for a question about lively plots, but I'm going to say that Thomas Hardy's novel Tess of the D'Urbervilles will be my choice. Years ago, after some healthcare issues had kept me from reading for much of 6 months to a year as I went through surgery and chemotherapy, I spent a lot of time watching Netflix and napping on the couch. At some point, I discovered BookTube. As my concentration gradually returned and I started to pick up books again, the first fiction I read was Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I read on a decade-old Kindle. I was utterly absorbed in the story, kept turning pages, and finished the book the night I started it. The next day, I picked up Return of the Native and finished it. By the end of the week, I had read all of Hardy's major novels, with the exception of Jude the Obscure, which I may be reading next month or perhaps in October. Now that I'm thinking about it, I might need that kind of shot in the arm again. Since very early in the pandemic, I've been reading almost exclusively nonfiction. Perhaps a Hardy novel will pull me back into my real life, one full of made-up stories, as Steve Donahue says, as much as nonfiction. Prompt number 5 is modern languages. Talk about a favorite translated work of fiction. I suspect this is another very unusual answer these days, but I really love Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. I ought to reread it sometime soon, perhaps in a different translation. I read it most recently a decade ago in the Lydia Davis translation. This time I want to try the Adam Thorpe version. Is that his name? I think so. Anyway, the links between Madame Bovary and Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Anna Karenina are fascinating to me. I also love thinking about how Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter is both similar and quite different. At some point, I might try to think about this issue, which I'm being cagey about because it's kind of a spoiler, a bit more seriously and put together a video. But since it's Jane Austen July, I think for this video, I want to mention a wholly different link. I'm intrigued with the similarities and differences about how women's reading is portrayed in Madame Bovary and Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. Can any of you add novels to that list that talk about how tropes of popular fiction shape the desires and perspectives of the characters who read those books? I'd love to make a longer list, so please sound off in the comments if you have some ideas. The next prompt is a quote from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Something in her air and manner of walking. Name a book with a strong atmosphere. Although it's Jane Austen July right now, the coming month will be the month of Faulkner in August, the month where BookTube turns to the atmospheric Southern world of William Faulkner, with his emphasis on how the complications of white Southern memory and lost cause ideology combine with the reality of U.S. Southern history. A few years ago, the choice for the Faulkner in August read-along was his novel Light in August, a book I read one lazy weekend in college and which turned me into a Faulkner fan, which I will use for my answer to the atmosphere prompt. It had taken me a few years to get over the horrid abridgment of The Bear, which I had read in high school. Yes, Faulkner's books are full of white supremacy and racist assumptions, which can be a lot to take. But there's also an awareness of the damaging effects of those power relationships. He's not writing happy nostalgia about the Old South. Yes, you will get that in a draped setting, but it's one filled with violence and pain and confusion, not one that romanticizes the Southern world. The walk that Faulkner's diverse characters walk would not qualify them as ladies in the Austen sense. Incidentally, in the show notes below, you can click through the hashtag to find this year's Faulkner in August, which might be even more unladylike than usual. Prompt 7. The tone of her voice, her address, and her expressions. The goal here is to discuss a book with beautiful writing. As I chatted with my spouse David about this question, my immediate thought for myself was a book with very plain writing. I didn't name it aloud because I imagined that I was supposed to talk about authors who use more decorated prose, more adjectives and metaphors and the like. David listed a couple of really beautiful books he'd read recently, but then said he thought I might choose Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping. And of course he was right. That was the book that had been in my thoughts, which I had been worried might seem to be a weird choice for this question. Don't get me wrong, I think most people think of Housekeeping as a deep and meaningful novel. But are they blown away by its prose? Certainly for me, writing that is plain and solid, that somehow combines strong and fragile, perhaps with a good sense of rhythm, is my favorite. Let me read a passage to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. Imagine a Carthage sown with salt, and all the sowers gone, and the seeds lain however long on the earth till there rose finally in vegetable profusion leaves and trees of rime and brine. What flowering would there be in such a garden? Light would force each salt calyx to open in prisms, and to fruit heavily with bright globes of water. Peaches and grapes are little more than that. And where the world was salt, there would be greater need of slaking. For need can blossom into all the compensations it requires. To crave and to have are as like as a thing and its shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue as sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. For to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. Though we dream and hardly know it, longing like an angel fosters us, smooths our hair, and brings us wild strawberries. I underlined this passage in my original copy of Housekeeping, and I shared it with one of the greatest poets in my class in college. At the time, he was unimpressed, and I was confused. At some point after we had lost touch, I Googled him and found an essay he had written about Robinson's perspective, and while he did not use that particular quote, he did refer to this particular idea, and that made me very happy. Okay, on to the 8th prompt, improvement of her mind by extensive reading. What is your next read? This weekend, I'm going to a little house in the middle of nowhere, actually fairly near a quiet beach, and right now I'm planning to take a 2021 biography of the playwright Lorraine Hansberry. The book is called Radical Visions and was written by Soyika Diggs Colbert and was published by Yale University Press. It will be joining Amani Perry's Looking for Lorraine on my shelves. Early next year, there will be a third major biography of Hansberry written by the lovely biographer Charles Shields, and I can't wait to read that as well. It should be a great experience to play these books off against one another. They're sure to have different perspectives and emphases. So finally we come to the question, would you be considered accomplished by Caroline Bingley and Mr. Darcy's standards? Sadly, I'm afraid I would not meet their standards. Luckily, Charlotte's wonderfully bookish transformations of the skills make me feel a bit more qualified. Thank you, Brian, for tagging me. Next week, I hope to come to you with another Jane Austen-related tag. Thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.